Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So today's video is going to be a review on a new eyeshadow palette. This is the ColourPop Kathleenlights So Jaded Eyeshadow Palette. It was recently released and I did get this in the mail from ColourPop, but I posted about it on my Instagram and I wanted to film an entire review after I thoroughly tested it out because a lot of you guys seem very conflicted about the palette. It seems like a lot of you guys like the palette, but you can't decide whether or not you actually want to add it to your collection, if you have other palettes that have very similar colors, if it's worth the money, because it is a little bit more of an expensive palette for ColourPop. So in today's video, I wanted to share all of the pros and the cons and let you guys know if I think it's worth picking up based on your personal makeup preferences. I'm going to put timestamps in the description box below so you guys can jump ahead if you are interested because I am going to cover a lot of information. I'll kick it off with just details about the palette, including price per gram and how it compares to some of their other palettes. And then I will talk about the actual shades in the palette and include swatches. I'll go through and share the dupes that I found in other ColourPop palettes. And then I'll finish up with 2 different looks using the palette. So I have a lot to cover, so let's jump into it. So like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, this palette is a collaboration with Kathleenlights, and I personally get excited when she does collaborate with ColourPop. I know that she does have quite a few collabs with them, but I personally think she does a really good job. Her collabs are always some of my favorites because I think she includes something for everybody. She tends to include neutrals, but also some really fun, colorful shades, and in general, I think that her collabs are really high quality, really interesting, and eye-catching. So I personally was excited to see what was inside when I saw this collaboration. So this is their first, I think they're calling it like their mega palette or giant palette. So this palette retails for $39. It does seem to be a higher price point for ColourPop. Obviously you are getting more shadow, so the price is going to be higher, but I think the $39 price tag has a few people hesitating because it is more than any of their other palettes. Their palettes usually retail for like $12 up to $24. Before this palette, their most expensive palette was the Perception palette, also the Through My Eyes palette. Those palettes have 16 shades and they retail for $24. So it is a $15 jump in terms of the price, but you also get more shadows. You get 14 more shadows. So the price went up, but the actual amount of product also went up. So I know price per gram doesn't matter to everybody, but I do like to include that information in case it does matter to you. So this palette comes with 30 shadows. 29 of the shadows come with 0.9 grams of product, and one shadow, which is the Super Shock shadow, comes with 1.4 grams of product. So there is 27.5 grams total. Now for comparison, like I said previously, the most expensive palette was the Perception palette. So since that one is the closest in terms of size, I wanted to compare that to this palette. So that palette comes with 16 different shadows. Each shadow has 1.10 grams, so slightly bigger pans. So there's 17.6 grams total, and that breaks down to be $1.36 per gram. So there's not a big difference price per gram when you do break it down and compare it to their other eyeshadow palettes. Okay, let's talk about the colors and the actual finishes. So there is one Super Shock shadow. The Super Shock shadow performs really well. It is pretty sheer, so it's almost more like an eyeshadow topper. I think it looks really pretty as an inner corner highlight, or you can layer it on top of other shadows just to add a little bit of something extra. There are 2 pressed glitters, and they've been including pressed glitters in their palettes. I personally don't use the pressed glitters. They're not marketed as eye-safe glitters, and I know there's some controversy regarding glitter in eye products. You have to do research for yourself to decide which products will work for you, which ones won't, but these aren't even marketed as eye-safe glitters, and they're pretty big glitters. There are 14 matte shadows, and one matte shadow does have shimmer in it. I don't feel like the shimmer actually transfers to the eye when you apply the shadow on your eye. Like if you go in with a fluffy brush, tap it off, all of the shimmer falls off, but that is worth noting. And then there are 13 satin or metallic shadows. The color story is actually pretty interesting. When I first saw this palette, I kind of thought that it was like a half neutral, half colorful palette, and I guess maybe it kind of is, but it's not your typical palette. A lot of these shades look very eye-catching and they have small details that differentiate them from other shades that are similar. Like if you swatch them or apply them to the eye, you might expect them to look one way, but then they have like very light micro shimmer that transforms the look. So I've been having a lot of fun playing around with it. I find that there is so much you can do. Obviously, because there are 30 shades, there are definitely more possibilities with the looks that you can create, but I think that a lot of the shades just coordinate very well with each other. Something else that's nice is that I don't find that it's a super warm toned palette. There are definitely warm shadows in here, but I think a lot of the shadows are cooler toned and a lot of them are neutral in undertone, so they don't lean super warm or super cool, which I think is a nice change. I'm personally a big fan of the jewel tones in here. I think there are so many intense, gorgeous, colorful shades that I cannot wait to wear and play around with even more. So I just wanted to quickly highlight 4 of my ColourPop palettes that had 4 or more dupes. Now, because this is a 30 pan palette, obviously there are going to be similar shades in other ColourPop palettes, and I'm not telling you to skip over this one and run out and buy another one because 4 of the shades are similar. I'm just saying if you have an extensive ColourPop collection like I do, maybe go through your palettes, and if you have a couple of these palettes that have quite a few dupes in them, you might not necessarily need to buy this one. So there is one palette that had quite a few dupes. This was actually a limited edition palette, so it's not like you can actually buy this one, but if you do own this palette, there were a lot of similarities in it. This one is the Disney Villains Misunderstood palette, and they actually sent this to me, I want to say only like a few months ago. It was after the actual launch of the collection, so I don't know that I ever really featured it on my channel, but this has like 6 or 7 very, very similar shades within it. And I like this palette because it does come with a lot of rich jewel tones. So if you're only buying the So Jaded palette based on those jewel tones or the dupes, then you might want to skip over it. But a lot of the shades in this palette are very, very similar. I will include, like I said, like side-by-side swatches for you, just so you can get a feel for which shades are similar. The Bretman Rock Lit palette is actually one of my favorites. I love the lit and wet palettes, but this one does have a lot of very similar tones. I'll just swatch the ones that are almost like identical, but even the ones that I don't swatch are somewhat similar to other shades in the So Jaded palette. So if you're really drawn to the warm tones in the So Jaded palette, you might be able to skip over it if you have this palette, or if you want to save a little bit of money and just purchase this 8-pan palette. Surprisingly, the Good Sport palette had some similar shades as well. I actually skipped over this one initially, and then I came back to it and swatched a couple, and I noticed that there were some similarities. And again, even if there aren't identical similarities, there are a couple of shades that are similar in tone, and maybe like the finish is just a little bit different. So that is one worth noting. I would say if you have this one, it's not necessarily a reason to skip over So Jaded, but there are a couple of shades that are similar between the two. And the last one that I wanted to mention is the Brown Sugar palette. This one actually has a couple of spot-on dupes. And then again, even the shades that aren't spot-on dupes are kind of similar. This is a really pretty neutral 9-pan palette that I really love. I think that it performs really well, but actually the shades Henna and Chalk are identical to 2 of the shades in the So Jaded palette. Last thing before I kind of share my final thoughts and get into the tutorial, the other 2 Kathleenlights palettes are very different from the So Jaded palette. Dream Street only has maybe one shade that is kind of similar. That would be like this really warm toned orangey shade, but the rest of the shades are unique. And then the Zodiac palette does have one exact dupe. Kathleen actually said the shade The Virgo is in the So Jaded palette. She just renamed it. I think it's Stoned. So other than that, the shades are really unique, and they're not even like somewhat similar. I mean, obviously with neutrals, you can call anything somewhat similar, but they weren't similar enough that I felt like they were worth noting. So if you do have her other collabs, if you're like just a Kathleen fan and you purchase these 2 palettes, I think you would be fine purchasing So Jaded. So my overall thoughts on the palette, I think the color story is very, very pretty. If you do not wear colorful eyeshadow, I don't think that you should purchase this one because there are quite a few colorful shades in it. If you love neutrals, but you really want to start wearing more color, I think that this would be a fun option because the colors just go so well with the neutrals in this palette, so you can create so many different seamless looks. But I definitely think it's easy to get quite a few looks using this palette. I don't necessarily feel overwhelmed, even though it is a pretty large palette, and I don't typically love large palettes. Here's my thought process. If you look at this palette and you're not into like half the palette, skip over it. If you don't wear colorful shades, this is not the palette for you. If you have quite a few neutrals and you don't think you necessarily want to try out these neutrals, skip over it because you're still paying $39. You do get 30 shadows, but it's really only worth it if you think you'll get use out of the majority of the shadows. You can go on the website and purchase a 12-pan palette for, I think they retail for like $16. So if you're debating between So Jaded and another 12-pan palette on the website and you think you'll use all of the shadows in the 12-pan palette, but you only think you'll use maybe half the shadows in So Jaded, save the money and just pick up the 12-pan palette. You can even get 2 different 12-pan palettes for $32 and save $7 and skip over this one. So, You know, I might even recommend that if you think there are more than like 6 or 7 shades in here that you wouldn't reach for. But like I said, I think the price is fair for what you get. I'm somebody who loves to do neutral looks, colorful looks, so I could see myself using all of the shades in the palette, but if that's not you, make sure to take it into account when you're thinking about buying it. I think there's such a nice variety of colors, and the way that it's laid out makes it easy to use. You can go in with any one of like the corners and create a really pretty look, and overall, I think it is worth the money if you will use the shadows in it. Okay, let me kick it off with the demo part of the video. I filmed 2 different looks. I did a warm toned look and then a little bit more of a cooler toned look, well, the look that I'm wearing today. So let's move into the warm toned look first, and then I'll come back and finish with this look. Okay, so to save a little bit of time, I did apply the Urban Decay Eyeshadow Primer Potion in the shade Eden all over my lid, and then I set everything into place with the shade My Precious just to lock it down. I am struggling with a little bit of dryness, if I didn't say this earlier, right under my brow bone. So if the shadows don't blend that well right in that area, it's definitely due to my own issue, not necessarily the shadow. So I'm going to kick off the look with the shade Royal Jewels and just blend that all over my eye as a transition color. This is just a really pretty light neutral shade, which would look nice all over the lid, but of course blended into the crease as well. I will put a list of all of the brushes that I'm using in the description box below in case you guys are curious about them. Next, I'm going to take the shade You're a Gem and just blend that right into the crease, right below the transition color. I don't want to bring this color up too high. We're just going to keep it a little bit lower and just blend these two together and create a little bit more of a gradient before we go in with some of the darker shades. I'm going to go in with the shade Carnelian, which is a pretty rich, intense orange. And again, I'm just going to use the same brush. I'm going to go in with a small amount at first because this shade is pretty pigmented. For such a rich shade, it is blending out really easily, which is good. Sometimes with some of the brighter shades, I tend to go in pretty heavy-handed, but I think that's why I like ColourPop's matte formula so much, because in general, it is very, very blendable. So if you are either a beginner with really intense, colorful shadows, or you just tend to have a heavy hand, or you struggle with blending, ColourPop shadows are nice because you do get that seamless blend. All of those shades blended together look really pretty, but they definitely look a little bit more pink than I was initially intending, so I am going to go in with a little bit more and a slightly heavier hand just to see if I can intensify that orange a little bit. So I really want to use 3 different shades. I want to use the shades Sunstone, Ruby, and Jasper. I'm going to focus Sunstone on the inner third of the corner, Ruby all over the center of the lid, and then the shade Jasper in the outer corner, kind of like a nice gradient from the inner corner to the outer corner. So I'm going to start with the shade Ruby all over the center of my lid, and then I'll go in with the other 2. Ruby is a pretty intense metallic. It's so gorgeous. If you love pinks or burgundies or berries, then I think there are some really gorgeous shades in here that you are going to enjoy. I'm actually going to blend this on the outer corner as well because I'll just go over it with a matte shadow to intensify it, but I'm going to try to keep the inner third of my lid pretty open. I'm just going to take a brush and kind of work this into the crease very lightly just to blend everything out. This shadow does tend to look a little bit more satiny on the eyes rather than like an intense metallic as well, so I do think that helps. Then I'm just going to take a little bit more of the shade Ruby and just really intensify the center of the lid because some of it did get blended away as I was trying to make everything look really smooth and even. Okay, I'm going to take the shade Sunstone on my finger as well, and I'm just going to place this right in the inner third and just kind of blend these 2 colors together. Let's move on to the shade Jasper, which is a little bit of a warmer brown, and I'm just going to work that into the outer corner just to make things look a little bit more intense and dramatic. All right, and then we're going to go back in with Sunstone and place that in the inner third as well. I tend to be a little bit messy when I do my eye makeup. I feel like that's why, you know, sometimes I don't do as many eyeshadow tutorials as I would like to. I don't necessarily have like the most proper technique, and I just kind of like go back and forth, and I never like finish up one step before I move on to the other, but I feel like that's just kind of how it is with makeup. There's not always like a perfect, clean, I guess, just process when you're doing your eyeshadow or your makeup in general. You just kind of have to see what's working, what isn't, and then adjust. So I'm just going to clean up the edges a little bit. And then as you can tell, there's really not a lot of fallout on my face, which is kind of crazy because I did use some pretty intense shades. There's a little bit on the nose, but really nothing under the eyes. So moving on to the lower lash line, I'm going to kick it off with the shade You're a Gem. And I'm just going to lightly blend that, connecting the lower lash line and kind of like that wing And then I'm going to take a little bit of the shade Carnelian and intensify the lower lash line just a little bit. I am going to apply my Urban Decay Perversion Waterproof Liquid Liner, and I'll be right back. Okay, so other than the eyeliner, the only other thing that I did was apply my Flower Beauty Warrior Princess Mascara on my bottom lashes, and then I took the shade My Precious, which is the shade that I used to set everything into place in the beginning of the video, and just highlighted my brow bone. That just helps the transition color blend or look a little bit more seamless. I do want to highlight the inner corners, so I think I'm also going to use the shade Sandstone for the inner corner, just because the other light shades that I'd probably use to highlight are probably slightly too cool toned for this look. So that is the first look. I wanted to do something colorful but not over the top. I do have a tendency to be very heavy-handed with colorful shadow because I do love color a lot, but I think that this palette makes colorful shadow a little bit more wearable because you can kind of mix it with something a little bit more toned down, like the shade Sandstone in like the inner third of my eye. And then the shade Jasper is perfect because it's not too intense, so it does kind of make the outer corner a little bit more dark and dramatic, but again, it's not over the top. You could make this look more colorful if you were to take the shade Garnet, which is like the matte version of Ruby, and place that in the outer corner because you would get more of like a pinky red look. But I think that this is a nice way to incorporate color into your makeup routine if you're typically intimidated by colors. So I hope you guys enjoyed this look. Okay, I am back for look number 2. It is not that easy to remove just your eye makeup and nothing else, but I think I did an okay job. So for this look, I think I'm going to go in with the green shades, which I'm sure I already said. So I did prime my eyes with the Urban Decay Primer Potion, and then I set everything into place with the shade My Precious. I'm going to go in with the shade Geodude, which is a really interesting brown. It kind of has like a green undertone or a little bit of like a yellow-green undertone. I definitely don't have anything like this in my makeup collection, but I feel like this was a nice addition to the palette because there are a lot of cooler tone shades in here, so I think it will be a nice transition color if you're going in with some of the grays, some of the greens. Next, I'm going to take the shade Jade, which is this really pretty mid-toned green that again has a little bit of a cooler undertone to it. And I'm just going to place that in the crease. I don't think I did a great job at setting down my eyeshadow primer evenly because, as you guys can tell, this is looking a little patchy, but I have used this shade and I didn't have any issues with it earlier. It's a lot more seamless on this side, so it's definitely due to the fact that I did not prime it well, unfortunately. It's weird because the Urban Decay Primer Potion is pretty smooth on its own, so I wouldn't think that you'd even have to set it. I usually just set it because everything does blend a lot better on top of primers if you do set them in place with shadow, but I'm kind of surprised because I didn't think it was a very sticky base. That's why I don't love to do first impressions videos, because if I was using this shadow for the first time, I might have attributed that skipping to the shadow rather than the fact that I didn't set my base as well as I could have. So I'm debating between two different looks. I can either take the shade Emerald for more of a super intense, vibrant look, or the shade Tiger Eye for more of a toned down look. I honestly can't decide between the two. I think I'm going to go in with Tiger Eye. This shade is actually kind of surprising because in the pan it looks a little bit more plain, I guess, for lack of a better word, but when you place it on the eye, it almost has like a slight hint of lime green shimmer. I'm just going to take a little bit more of Jade and really blend that out. That's a really, really pretty color. It's interesting. I don't really have a lot of colors like that in my makeup collection. This isn't really an eye look that I would typically go for, so it's kind of fun to switch it up. That being said, I'm just kind of craving a little bit more color, so I am going to take the shade Emerald. Yes, this is like a true, rich emerald green, which is actually my birthstone, and I'm just going to place that in the outer corner. I just want something a little bit more vibrant. You know what? I'm just going to go over the whole lid with emeralds. It's just so pretty and intense. I do think I'm going to go in with that Peridot shade. I don't know if it's Peridot or Peridot. I watched like 4 YouTube videos pronouncing the word and they all said it differently, or they said you can say it both ways. So I'm going to go with Peridot. But I just want to take a little bit and then tap it right in the center. Oh, this is so pretty. This would be really pretty on its own as well, but on top of this emerald green, it just like adds like the perfect highlight right to the center of the lid. And then I'm just going to go in with a little bit of emeralds on both the inner and outer corners, just to create kind of like a halo eye. I don't want to call it a halo eye exactly. I just kind of want to Yeah, I mean, I guess like a halo eye. More of like a messy, undone halo eye though, not anything too structured. Okay, so for the bottom lash line, I am going to take the shade Jade to begin with, which is the matte shadow, and just kind of blend that on the lower lash line. Actually, I don't know if I'll go in with the metallics on the lower lash line. Usually I just match whatever I did on the lid, but maybe we'll leave the really intense, colorful shades to the lid today. So I'm going to apply eyeliner and then I'll be right back. Okay, so I applied the Flower Beauty Warrior Princess Mascara on the bottom lashes again, and then I took the Urban Decay 24/7 Glide On Eye Pencil in the shade Mildew and just applied that to my waterline. So the only thing that I have left to do is apply a highlight shade in the inner corner. I think I'm going to take a little bit of the shade Moonstone and apply that on the inner corner. It's kind of like a pretty silvery color. And then I'm just going to take a little bit of the shade Pearl and place that right on top. So that is the second look. It turned out a little bit more vibrant and intense than I originally intended, but I do like it. I really wanted to go in with some of the more intense shades just because I love greens, and there are some pretty subtle greens in here as well. So I'm looking forward to using even more of the jewel tones. I've been enjoying them so far, but I am just like craving color these days, so I can't wait to play around with this palette even more. Okay guys, that is the end of my video. Thank you so much for watching. I'm sure this was a little bit of a longer video, but I really wanted to be thorough and let you guys know my thoughts on the palette and really share the pros and the cons so you could decide if it is something worth picking up. I hope today's video was helpful for you. Let me know what you guys think. If you're planning on picking up the palette or if you already picked it up, let me know what you think in the comment section below. But otherwise, I'll see you very soon with a new video. Bye.